इतना कुछ कहने के बाद पता नहीं कहाँ से शुरू करें लेकिन I will speak in English. So thank you very much. I think this has been very inspiring. I feel very sorry that I missed yesterday's session, but nevertheless the summary was very interesting, and I will reflect, just advance a couple reflections about what could be a perspective to look for in the next coming years in relation to labor, but also not just labor, but what is surrounding labor and often is not really discussed. One of the interesting things about about participating in events organized by ActionAid is that you're looking at many of the challenges from different perspectives, not only the labor perspective. And for someone who's working in the ILO, like me, this is always very interesting because you see all these connections which often are not necessarily visible in the everyday work that we do. We're looking at wages, you're looking at time, overtime, entitlement, social security issues. You often tend to sometimes get lost in the struggles of workers and not necessarily make the connections which are happening in, say, what was referred to challenges in rural areas that are determining somehow how challenges in urban areas are happening, or issues related to women's struggles and so on. So I think this is really, it's been very interesting to hear, and particularly also this discussion that was that happened around the blurring lines between formality and informality. Let me just say that from my perspective, I fully agree that while there are many things that are formalizing the economy, there's also many processes, including policies, that are also creating informality, and there can be abusive situations of work now for both formal and informal work, and therefore all this portraying of formal work as a goal to strive forward towards is not necessarily an accurate way of looking at things, unless you try to address the issues of abuse and coercive labor that are happening within the formal sector as well. So of course, so I'll come to that. So just to look at a couple elements, I think there's been a lot of discussion about some of the structural aspects of what's happening within the country, and it's not happening only here. There is a transformation of the rural economies, the urban economies that is happening, and that transformation is massive, and it has losers and it also has winners, of course, and that is also one of the drivers of migration to urban areas, migration to other parts of the country, the loss of different types of occupations in some areas, and the emergence of new types of occupations, precarious in particular, that are also emerging. So in that context, you can look at how is it that rural challenges are determining in certain ways what is happening in their urban areas, and what was mentioned a little bit before, I think, in reference to Dr. Ambedkar, and linking rural to urban sort of struggles is particularly important, and those are the types of connections which many of the people who are present here, whether it's academics, activists, trade union leaders, and others, can see, because you've been thinking about this. But so that's quite important. But there are a couple connections which are not necessarily always understood, and when explaining these sort of things to an outside world where people have an everyday job and they have to basically assume their livelihoods, many of these ideas sound a little bit theoretical and abstract. In fact, one of the most common types of criticisms would be that a lot of these connections are conspiracy theories, right? And this is a common thing. So I think it's important to understand that while it is important not to fall in a conspiracy theory type of an approach. It's important also not to fall in the trap of not seeing conspiracies where they do exist. I mean, it's important to see things in different perspectives. And therefore, in these links that we're able to see, I think it's important to start trying to deconstruct some of the common ideologies that everyone has. It's not just a matter of India, it's a matter of that challenges, where challenges are faced in other countries. Deconstruct these ideologies that are existing among ourselves. And it's not only about the solidarity among the labor movement. There are a couple things that I don't think have necessarily been touched, maybe a little bit. There was a bit of a talk about the role of media, which I'll come to very quickly. But there's also issues of security policies, because if you want to build, I mean, the whole idea of this workshop is to look at the strength of the labor movements. And so one of the questions that comes to mind is, what is it that holds together a labor movement? How is it solidarity is created? And and the other question could be, then how is solidarity broken? That's a perhaps slightly more interesting way of looking at things, even just for a moment, because there are policies that actually break solidarity. There is fear is something which is caused by specific policies. What are those policies? How is that engendered in the minds of workers, whether they're women, whether they're Dalits, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Adivasi or others? That's one thing. The other issue is, of course, the role of scarcity. Scarcity is not determined by necessarily labor policies. Of course, there are some influences, but most of the work most of the issues that actually relate to workers also are determined, and primarily determined by economic policies, agricultural policies, financial policies, which are outside the scope of, say, what a traditional Ministry of Labor would normally be looking at, and even in many cases, Ministry of Labor still look at only from a sort of a specific labor perspective. So it's important to be able to connect and understand how those economic policies do create or not scarcity, because if they do create scarcity, then of course it's important to start articulating what are those challenges. And the role of the media, of course, is very important, because if these connections can be voiced, then you can basically convince others, and it's important to then build solidarity and then widen these types of movements so that they can end up in some type of a change. However, if they can't even be expressed, then there is a problem. And of course, it's important to look at the context of the consolidation of media in the hands of different types of private sector groups, and how that plays a role in labor struggles as well. So I'm just outlining a couple of these challenges, which are quite important, and I think it's important also, since particularly you have also here academics, to try to see how these types of issues can be deconstructed and then reconstructed, so that these ideologies that do exist can basically be broken down, and there's space to actually connect. It doesn't take much for change to happen. I'm an optimist more than a pessimist. I really think that once you have a critical mass that can be not necessarily, it can involve also few numbers, and you have good arguments, things can change, but it's a question of finding the right links and the right networks to be able to present things. Now, I'm saying things in a very abstract way, but there's also practical things, that of course we could also suggest. Is, for instance, if you're looking at the example I was referring to from rural areas to urban areas, it is enough to start talking in rural areas or in states of origin, like in whether it's Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, or the such, where you have where people are migrating from and going to areas like the National Capital Region, Hyderabad, Bombay, Mumbai, and so on. You could those things may be happening. Okay, thanks. So, but it is possible to sensitize people in the state governments about working conditions in destination states. That's just a very simple example. If you have an MP, say in Orissa, who's sensitized about what are the working conditions in garment work in, say, in Tirupur, and as an MP, through also the state structures, they can apply pressure within the structures, whether it's in Tamil Nadu or in Karnataka. It starts bringing a certain critical influence into the picture, which can influence policies. And it's important to find those entry points and apply pressure in those entry points, provide evidence, and in order to be able to change things. And so I'm just suggesting a couple sort of ideas that are important in making these connections. It's not always easy because, of course, say, if you take the instance of garment workers, most of whom, I mean, I think more than 95%, which are not organized, then in the everyday struggle of trying to make a living, particularly women, it's very difficult to then start seeing what are the connections with the country, the state of origin. How is it that that having a discussion with a MP in the state of origin can actually make a difference. I mean, this is just an example, but and this is valid also not only for India, but other countries where we are working as well. So I'm just very generally outlining some types of ideas I think are quite important. The last point I wanted to mention is basically summarizing the notion that, of course, there's increasing unemployment. There is not enough decent jobs being created, and therefore, in that sort of a context, with informality also being an important aspect of the economy, what tends to happen is that you have an increasing role of intermediaries, particularly labor intermediaries, because when you don't have sufficient good working conditions, then those few employers who can offer those working conditions, they will need some sort of intermediary not to be held accountable for the poor working conditions that they provide. At the same time, the worker also needs the intermediaries. They need the intermediaries to be able to find better working conditions. Of course, there are intermediaries that are good, there are intermediaries that are bad, but it's important to, I think, understand that just criminalizing intermediaries, which is the tendency in many countries, including in India. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the way that a lot of trafficking organizations look at the role of intermediaries. Or how it's looked up in the anti-trafficking bill, or how it represents itself in other, in a lot of the criminal justice world. Then in that sort of context, what you end up doing is that the lowest, the most powerless types of intermediaries that play an important role, they become the culprits, but not necessarily the actual employers or the actual larger contractors that play an important role. So I just wanted to say that because it's sort of a myth that is definitely emerging and that needs to be debunked. So I will leave it with that, and I wanted to thank once again ActionAid and all the panelists who are here for what they have said. It's been very inspiring, and I definitely would like to continue participating in these types of workshops. Thank you.